Okay, good afternoon, everybody. I just want to make sure that before we get it all going, I emailed out the source sheets for today's class. I just want to make sure that you've all received it. If not, I could do something about it. I'm going to put the chat on. I think the way that we can manage this whole thing is it's going to be more lecture-y just because of the nature of the Zoom situation. And then you'll be able to send via the chat your questions, comments along the way, and God willing, we will have time to address them, whether mid-shiur or toward the end. We'll figure all of those things out as we go along. It's great to see some friends who I haven't seen in quite some time, and it's great to reconnect in this particular way. And so all the people who I can see, hello, I'm happy to see you. Those whose names I recognize but only see audio in play, that's good too. Welcome back. And all those people who I don't know, who have joined us, that's what this is all about. So hello, my name is Hayyim Angel. I'm the National Scholar of the Institute for Jewish Ideas and Ideals, and this three-part series is sponsored by the Institute. And I don't need to tell you this, our whole core mission is taking the time and the trouble to develop scholarly approaches to the complexities of this world that we live in, knowing that Judaism is a world religion. We have a voice not only for the Jewish community, but really for everybody. And given what's been happening recently with regard to racism, discrimination, all these things that have just been percolating to the surface, hold on one second, I'm just going to attach the source sheets because I see that I'm getting a request and I could do something about it. Okay, so voila. So there it is. So hopefully most of you have it, but those of you who just got it, welcome. And now you have the source sheets also. Chat is so cool like that. I really have been a big fan from its inception. And so this three-part series will really be about Judaism and humanity, what the Tanakh itself, what the Jewish Bible has to say about this very critical issue. And we're going to go through selected texts, rabbinic opinions. Another value of the Institute, something that we promote all the time, is that there's no such thing as the Jewish opinion of X. Right? There's not one opinion on anything of substance, and certainly not meaningful, complex topics like this. You're not going to hear this opinion with me presenting it as, this is what Judaism teaches. What I am going to try to present is what I believe is a faithful, authentic, biblical portrait of the issues that we're going to be discussing. Occasionally, we will, of course, be addressing rabbinic opinions, or at least some of them along the way. But I'm aware that there are dissenting opinions. Occasionally, I will even have to mention them for the sake of disagreeing with them so that we can see that there are multiple approaches that are out there, some which I believe are closer to the biblical vision and some which I believe are a little more distant as we go along. Okay, so on that happy note, I'll tell you that the chosen people, which is today's topic, is when I started teaching, I realized that this was one topic I did not want to teach. I was very, very uncomfortable with it. It was one of those weird moments where I had known from the time I was very, very little that I was chosen. I knew that many of you were chosen, whether or not I knew you or whether or not you were born yet, didn't matter. And I thought that that was great. When I learned about this in elementary school, I was very pleased. It was an excellent, feel-good sort of thing. And that was great. And then you get older and you realize, okay, you might feel good. Well, A, what does it mean anyway? And B, how do you present it to other people? And my general rule of thumb is you can't present something to other people unless you really think that yourself. And I realized that there was this gap where I had no clue what I was talking about, and I felt uncomfortable by whatever I was taught when I was younger. So it became a moment of research, which took a bunch of years just to try to break ground on the basic issues because it involves the entire biblical tradition. It's not that there's one chapter or one narrative or one law that tells you everything you want to know. But quite to the contrary, it's a very complex topic that spans the entire biblical period, the whole rabbinic period, down into the present. Most of the time when I teach in a non-coronavirus setting, I'm teaching in synagogues, schools, I teach educators, I teach children, whatever it's going to be, but mostly or extremely predominantly very Jewish environments and very Jewish settings. I think the most interesting venue that I ever spoke in at all, but it was a particularly good moment for this, was back in 2007. Don't ask me how this happened. I was invited to speak at the NBA National Annual Dinner. Don't ask me who connected who to what, and all of a sudden I was there, and I had to give an invocation at this NBA Annual Dinner. It was right around Thanksgiving time. And so I made them a deal. Invocations are not my bag at all. It's just some kind of generic sounding blessing. And I didn't, whatever. I like blessings, but I didn't want to do that at all. So I said, look, let me have 5 minutes. I promise I won't go over, but let me say something of substance. So they bought in. And so I spoke about the chosen people. I figured I got 5 minutes. Let's just give them the heart and soul of the whole thing in 5 minutes, and this and that. It was great. Now, this is probably the moment where I have to tell you that this was the National Bible Association and dinner. So that's the NBA that we're talking about. So I wasn't the shortest guy in the room, but the NBA is an extremely Christian organization. This was actually the first time that they had invited Jews, and there were 6 of us. There were 6 Jews, all rabbis. One was a rabbinical student at the time. Eating, I think it was Levana's catered meals, and it was hundreds and hundreds of Bible-believing Christians of every denomination. And if you've been to any kind of dinner when there is an invocation, you know that the invocation is at the very beginning of the program. So the other 5 Jewish people were late to the dinner, that's what I would have done if I weren't giving the invocation. So I was actually the only Jew in the room speaking to many hundreds of Bible-believing Christians talking about the chosen people. Now, I had a good time, and you'll be happy to know that they all clapped at the end and actually invited me to speak at a subsequent dinner. So it actually was pretty well received, which made me feel very good about stuff. And I didn't skimp. I told them exactly what I thought in the 5-minute version. But today we have an opportunity to go through really some of the critical texts and to really develop it as a shiur rather than just a 5-minute quick time slot. It all starts with one of the most important texts in the entire Tanakh, if you ask me, and that's in source number 1 over here. I'm going to read the English sources, but you have the Hebrew and the English in front of you, so you pick whatever you fancy, and that's all cool. God said, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness. They shall rule the fish of the sea, the birds of the sky, the cattle, the whole earth, and all the creeping things that creep on earth." God created man in his image. The image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. Of all of our thinkers in rabbinic history, probably nobody as much as Rambam took this text and just ran with it. But I mean, every great rabbinic thinker was aware of it and dealt with it however he dealt with it. But Rambam really took its implications to its fullest. What this passage is saying, and what the whole beginning of the Torah is telling us, is that it doesn't start with the Jewish people. It doesn't start with Abraham. It doesn't start with Moshe. It doesn't start with the Torah. This is not a trivial starting point. The Torah wants to set out a vision where all humanity is A, created in God's image, whatever that means, and B, all humanity is one family. All right? The Torah did not have to tell the story this way, but it does. This was a revolution beyond revolutions in the ancient Near East. Nobody had this concept. I mean, for polytheists, the whole idea, you ask any good cultured Babylonian or Egyptian, they always believed that the best gods created them, and that either lesser gods or crummy gods or demons created other people. So not everybody was created equal. Not only were they not one family, but they weren't on the same standing as being human. So the idea of racism goes back as a theology to the very beginnings of history. The idea that the Torah shows up on the scene at the time of Moshe, where God tells us all people are created in God's image and all people are a family, is a game changer in the biggest possible way. And now in terms of what it means, I don't know, but Rav Saadia Gaon really set out what seems to be at least a major part of the mark of what it means to be created in God's image, namely that it has to do with God's function, not appearance, obviously, but rather a functional thing. Excuse me one second. We create, we have to build a good world. That seems to be a basic feature of it. I'll tell you that whether or not this is part of the biblical definition, one aspect of humanity that gets hit home from the very beginning of creation and all the way through is that, I like to ask it this way, Cain, who is notorious for being the world's first murderer, so I don't have very many good things to say about him, but I'll say a good thing about him. He also invented sacrifice, before he became the world's first murderer. How did he know to do that? Right, the Torah just very matter-of-factly says that he grew some produce and then he offered some of it to God. How in the world did he think of doing that? He didn't have the book of Leviticus. He didn't have any text in front of him. God didn't command him to do this. Where did it come from? And later in the same chapter, it's all chapter 4 of Genesis, people are praying to God. How do they know to pray to God? How do they know God at all? without being prophets? How do they know to reach out to God at all? It seems clear to me that one aspect of God's image, whatever it means in some philosophical sense, which is beyond me, is that people are inherently looking for some religious connection. Pagans are too. They're very spiritual, religious people, albeit they're gravely misguided as far as the Torah is concerned. But still, it's a very religious impulse to look at the cosmos and to worship the sun or the moon or the stars or the sea or the wind or whatever, or many hundreds of other things, but it's still coming from a very deeply religious impulse place. So the Torah sets out that people have a religious impulse from built into humanity. Here's another thing. If you were Cain's lawyer, and who doesn't want to be that from time to time? If you were Cain's lawyer after Cain is a murderer and he kills Abel, his brother, and God says, hey, how could you do that? You killed your brother. If you're Cain's lawyer, you don't even have to be a good lawyer. You just say, how did I know that murder was wrong? My client doesn't know. Nobody told him that murder is prohibited. So why should he think that there's anything negative about it at all? He was jealous, and so he acted on that. Okay. Sue me. There's nothing, there's simply no claim in the Torah that God commanded against murder. Or when God floods the world, so the whole humanity's lawyers should show up, even though they just drowned, and say, hey, how come you're flooding out the world? Nobody told us that this was wrong. So this is critical to the Torah's vision that it's trying to get across, which is that two things get across loud and clear. All humanity is presumed religiously inclined, and all humanity is deemed responsible enough to act in a minimally moral way and can be held accountable if they don't, even if nobody told them otherwise. All right? So these are two very basic presumptions of the Torah. Now, the one family presumption is in source number 2, and I had to boldface because there is a world of difference. Our printed editions of the Talmud add one word that is not in any of the old manuscripts of the Talmud. So I boldfaced it for you so you can see what a world of difference it is to people who just study Talmud from the printed text and who just know the scholarship behind the text. In source number 2, therefore, Adam, the first man, was created alone, to teach you that with regard to anyone who destroys one soul, that's the manuscript version, not with the Jewish people part. The verse ascribes him blame as if he destroyed an entire world, as Adam was one person from whom the population and entire world came forth. It should be obvious that it has nothing to do with Jews, because we're talking about Adam, who among other characteristics of his was not Jewish. There was no such thing as Jewish yet. Adam is not about the people of Israel. Adam is all of humanity. At some later point, the word Yisrael was added, or from the Jewish people was added. And that obviously changes the fundamental meaning of the text, where suddenly it's about if you destroy a single Jewish life, you've destroyed a world. That is true, but no more true than destroying any life, which is what the Mishnah is actually trying to teach. Okay? Conversely, anyone who sustains one soul, the verse ascribes him credit as if he sustained an entire world. And this was done due to the importance of maintaining peace among people, so that one person will not say to another, my father is greater than your father. In other words, the Mishnah quite correctly understands that this opening chapter of the book of Genesis, which says that all people are created in God's image and we all descend from Adam, eliminates any possibility of racism. Since we're all one family, nobody could claim genetic superiority of any kind. Okay, so this is a basic theological teaching of the Torah, one that gets across loud and clear from the very beginning, and the Mishnah understands it very, very, very well. So again, I apologize for the later addition in the printed editions with E, with regard to Yisrael, or from the Jewish people, but that's not the fundamental text. That's not what the rabbis wrote. The rabbis of the Mishnah understood very well, as again, scholarship has much to say about this, examining the manuscript evidence, but it wouldn't make sense to include Israel in that sentence. So far, so good. All of human history is people created as one family in God's image. They're expected to live some basic moral life, and they're expected to have some kind of religious impulse. So far, so good. We now know that humanity failed. Adam and Eve failed, and Noah's generation failed, and finally you have the Tower of Babylonia, the Tower of Babel, right? So the rabbi who understood very, very, very well, it's amazing, he lived in 16th century Italy, but he understood the premise of 3 strikes and you are out. right? Which is truly prescient. I mean, it's amazing that he could have possibly anticipated one of the most important baseball rules of all. And that's Rabbi Ovadia Sforno. Rabbi Ovadia Sforno understood very, very, very well that the whole book of Genesis revolves around the theme of the chosen people. And that originally, there should not have been a chosen people. All humanity was chosen. The only reason God moved over to Abraham and his descendants is because of the failings of the early generations of humanity. And that was the 3 strikes and you're out principle. First, Adam and Eve fail and they get banished from Eden. Then the Noah generation gets flooded out. And finally, you have the Tower of Babel. And that's the moment where God breaks rank with humanity. And the very next chapter is where God selects Abraham to become a chosen nation. So Rabbi Sforno says this in source number 4. In his introduction to Genesis. I believe he fully understands what the book is about, so I'm just going to plagiarize him. It then teaches that when hope for the return of all humanity was removed, as it had successfully destroyed God's constructive intent 3 times already, God selected the most pious of the species and chose Abraham and his descendants to achieve his desired purpose for all humanity. Okay, so this is correct. Rabbi Ovadia Sforno exactly nails what the book of Genesis is driving at, that there's a 3 strikes and you're out principle. But hypothetically, the what if, there are many what ifs. Had Adam and Eve never failed, well, then all humanity would just be munching on fruit in this orchard in the Garden of Eden. Right? You would have this utopian world, a fully redeemed world where everybody is simply doing what God wanted people to do. Had people been moral in the time of Noah, the vision would be, you'd be done. We already would have won. The only time that you start having an individual nation that is chosen among the nations is Abraham. He starts a new nation while the rest of humanity continues to exist, albeit on a different plane. So this is a sea change as far as the biblical record is concerned. And then, what's the whole rest of the book of Genesis? There are some fabulous stories. We'll talk about all of them on some other occasion, God willing. But the theme of Genesis is, it's not all of Abraham's descendants after all. First you have, this is just a fun biblical trivia question. How many sons did Abraham have just in the text of the Torah? Leave alone midrashim or other derivations. Just explicit sons that Abraham had. So the answer, okay, this is the one bummer of Zoom. Zoom has many pluses. One bummer is that it's fun to ask this to a room of people and you watch people get very nervous because they wanted to say 2, but they figure if I'm asking the question, they think it's a trick. Now the truth is, it's not a trick question. Abraham had 8 sons. He had the famous 2, Ishmael and Yitzchak, but he also had 6 others by a woman named Keturah at the very end of his life. You could look it up. It's in chapter 5 of Genesis. 6 sons just bangs him out over there after so many years of barrenness and struggles over having any child at all. Suddenly he's quite prolific and fertile at the end of his life. So he ends up with 8 sons in the text of the Torah. But we all know that only Isaac moves forward as the chosen nation. Now, Isaac and Rebekah have, now you're all going to pause, but it still is 2. This time you're right. They actually have 2 sons that we know about, right? Jacob and Esau. And this time we find out that Esau is filtered out and it's only going to be Jacob's family that becomes the chosen nation. And then you understand very well that when Jacob starts favoring Joseph, if you're just keeping your finger on this theme, you realize it's not just bad parenting. Right, which it most certainly is, and it leads to a great drama and a lot of tragedy and a fantastic musical. That's what it does on that level. But the more important point for our purposes is that as far as we're concerned as readers of the Bible, and possibly even as much as the characters in the text itself are concerned, Joseph is going to continue the chosen people and the other brothers are going to be rejected. That's what we're all expecting to happen. It's not until the end of Genesis, when all the brothers are together, Joseph, I don't know if forgives is the right word, but he certainly moves past the conflicts and reunites the family. That's when you learn the whole nation of Israel, or these 12 tribes, are all part of this chosen nation. And then all Exodus is the consummation of this chosen family becoming a nation. They go through slavery, Exodus, and the receiving of the Torah and building of the tabernacle. We're done. The whole first 2 books of the Torah on a macro level are about the formation of the chosen people. Originally, it should have been all of humanity, but 3 strikes and you're out. The rest of the book of Genesis is about how most branches of the Abraham family are not chosen branches either. And that by the end of Genesis, we finally have a consolidated picture of who they are. And the book of Exodus is then the consolidation of that. So why did God choose Abraham? So I don't know. I don't guess God's mind ever unless God tells me explicitly what he's thinking in the Torah. But we do have an important answer that the Torah gives to the classic fill in the blank question, which is Abraham obviously was something special. And in fact, he was even the first something. So Abraham was the first blank. All right, so when you're little, you might learn that he was the first Jew, right? And then at some point you get a little more sophisticated and realize how anachronistic that term Jew is in the context of Abraham. So you scrap that. And then you say, oh, he was the first monotheist. And then you feel more sophisticated. But that's just plain wrong, because the Torah tells you that the first monotheist was Adam. Paganism, the world didn't start pagan according to the Torah. The world started monotheistic, and paganism is the deviation. It crept in later. So Abraham was not the first monotheist at all. He simply was doing what Noah and Adam and others had done. So the only thing that he really is the first of, that is of note, that obviously plays a role in our definition of the chosen people, is he was the very first person willing to spend money on day school tuition. Right? That's really what makes him so special. Or in God's language, not quite like that. Source number 3, he was the first educator. Noah, as righteous as he was, has no education of his children on his agenda. He might have educated his kids, I don't know. But I can tell you that the Torah doesn't play that up at all, whereas the Torah most certainly does play this up with Abraham. That's source 3 over here. The Lord said, shall I hide from Abraham that thing which I do? Seeing that Abraham shall surely become a great and mighty nation, and all the nations of the earth shall be blessed in him. For I know him that he will command his children and his household after him. And they shall keep the way of the Lord to do justice and judgment, so that the Lord may bring upon Abraham that which he has spoken of him. So God celebrates the fact that Abraham is willing to teach his children and his society this vision of godliness, specifically righteous religiosity, which comes with a built-in moral component. Okay, so far so good. We have all people are created in God's image. All people should have been the chosen people, or really better, the chosen species among all of the species of the world. That failed after 3 attempts. After the Tower of Babel, God changed his plan and decided to select the moral offspring of the most righteous person on the planet, namely Abraham. Abraham is celebrated not only for being religious moral, but also for teaching others. He has an educational role to play. And the rest of Genesis simply whittles down Abraham's family until you finally get the children of Israel, the Bnei Israel, or the children of Jacob, who will found the chosen nation. Okay, so this was actually pretty straightforward. I will mention one rabbinic debate here that's of relevance and will carry through with us also for the rest of the time. My whole thesis here, which is just Forno's thesis, I'm just plagiarizing him the whole time because I think he's right. There's one blip, and it's important to just note that blip. The Torah doesn't say, like with Noah, for example. It says that Noah was a righteous man. And then God told Noah, the world is bad, you're good. I'm going to bring a flood, you build an ark, you'll be safe. Great. I know that God saved Noah, at least in part, because Noah was righteous. It doesn't say in the Torah that God chose Abraham because Abraham was righteous. It just says that God spoke to Abraham, go and leave your homeland and your birthplace and go to the land that I will show you. But the Torah doesn't preface that with, since Abraham was incredibly righteous, God chose him from among all the species, all the people or all the families on earth to become this chosen people. Okay, so this is an important blip in everything that I've said so far. It doesn't note Abraham's merit. So there are 2 rabbinic slants to how to manage that. One slant is to assume God knows his customers. He's righteous. The rest of the story plays that out, and God knew that in advance. So he chose him because he's righteous. Even if the Torah didn't inform us of that yet, it was an obvious choice. That's the approach that you'll see in people like Rambam, Maimonides, and Ramban, Nachmanides, and many, many other thinkers. They assume that Abraham was righteous prior to God choosing him in the first place, and therefore God made the obvious choice. That's a perfectly reasonable assumption. A second approach is that of Maharal of Prague. He says, no, the Torah deliberately doesn't say that God chose Abraham because he was righteous. It's because the Torah is trying to say that Abraham's chosenness is not contingent on good behavior. And this is important because Maharal realizes that I'm going to ask a very difficult question in about 30 seconds, which is, okay, fine. This thesis works great. But now there are 2 hard questions. God rejected humanity and chose Abraham because humanity was bad and Abraham was good. I'm cool with that. All right, so, but now what's not cool? Well, let's say Abraham's descendants become wicked. Can they stop being chosen? And the flip side, let's say what we would call non-Jewish people, let's say Gentile nations, become righteous again. Can they re-become chosen, right? Those are the two obvious questions that have to emerge from all of these things. Hang on one second. I already see trouble. Okay, there you go. These are two important questions. In fact, they're so important that they animate the whole rest of Tanakh. So Maharal is trying to thwart the question of can the Jews stop being chosen, right? Maharal is saying even if the Jews sin, and bless us, we've definitely done our fair share of sins through the years, there's nothing that could jeopardize our chosen status. Whereas if you hold that the whole concept of chosenness is contingent on righteous behavior, which is the view of Rambam and Ramban and many others as well, then you should be able to lose it. It should be that sinful behavior should undermine chosenness just as much as righteous behavior attains chosenness. Okay, so to make this work, we have to go through some of the critical biblical texts, including source number 5. The best place to look is right at the consummation of God's chosen people at Mount Sinai, where God is about to reveal the Torah to Moshe and the people of Israel. And source 5. Now, therefore, if you will obey my voice indeed and keep my covenant, then you shall be my own treasure among the people, for all the earth is mine. And you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words which you shall speak to the people of Israel. Now, I didn't read it right because I didn't use enough italics. But it seems fair if I would just italicize the right word here, you'd get it, which is, now, therefore, if you will obey my voice indeed, ... Sounds very clear that God is saying at the get-go, at the exact moment of consummation, if the people of Israel remain faithful to this Torah that they are about to receive, then they will be God's treasured nation, and then they can be a nation of priests. Thumb. And if they don't remain faithful, then they should lose their chosenness. They should not be God's treasure, and they should stop. That sounds like the basic implication of what God is saying at the revelation at Sinai. And this view is carried over into the works of the prophets. One of my personal favorite examples is source number 6, the book of Hosea, who's one of the 8th century BCE northern prophet of Israel. Hosea lived at a time right when the Assyrians were about to exile the 10 tribes that you and I call the 10 lost tribes. And he had to marry an Eshes Nunim, often translated as prostitute, whatever it is, some promiscuous woman. And he had 3 children with her. And they bore symbolic names. And the third of those 3, I mean, you can see it over here in source 6. She conceived and bore a son. Then he said, this is the third of the 3 sons, name him Lo Ami, for you are not my people and I will not be your God. In other words, since you're sinning, you're not my nation anymore. It's a dreadful name for the kid to have while he goes to nursery school, but that's his problem right now. My problem is, this seems to basically be exactly what God said to the people of Israel at Mount Sinai. If you are faithful, then you will be my treasured nation, but now you're not. You're not sinning anymore, you're out of here. And Hosea raises a very important issue that all of the later prophets deal with in some form or another. This is where I get to just be me as a romantic, playing around with the fact that the prophets were much greater romantics than I can ever hope to be. One of the most powerful and potent images that the prophets developed, based on Torah already, is the idea that God and Israel enjoy different aspects of a relationship. Some are more fear-driven. God is the master, we are the slave. God is the king, we are the subject. But they're also loving components. God is the parent and we are the children. God is the husband and we are the wife. Hosea is playing around with this husband-wife one. And the idea is that Israel was an unfaithful wife by going astray with idolatry and other terrible sinful behavior. And now God is saying, okay, you're out of here. In other words, the marriage is on the rocks. And a question that the prophets deal with very directly is, when God says you're out of here, is this, to use our terminology, but also prophetic terminology, is this a separation or a divorce? If it's a divorce, that's it, it's over. It's a permanent break in the marriage. If it's a separation, then the idea is that this is rehab. Okay, the marriage isn't working, Israel has cheated, but God wants the marriage to resume once Israel shapes up her act. If that's the case, then it's a separation, not a divorce. So the prophets actually deal with this in several ways, but the short answer is that it's a separation, not a divorce. One of the most poignant passages in the book of Isaiah in source number 7, dealing with the exile, where the prophet says, "Thus says the Lord, where is the bill of your mother's divorcement with which I have put her away? There was never any get." This is a separation, silly. You're not permanently rejected. The prophet is talking to despondent Jews who think that it's over and that the God-Israel relationship is finished. So God responds to the prophet, no, this was a separation. Don't you get it? It's not a divorce. The prophet Hosea, who I mentioned a moment ago, takes exactly the same imagery and constantly develops the idea that God is always trying to rehabilitate the marriage. It's not over. So the idea of a divorce is not on the books, with one exception, and it's a really interesting one. There's a law in the Torah that if man is married to woman, it's in Deuteronomy chapter 24, if you want to look it up. Woman is married to man. Man divorces woman, gives get. The get is a Torah law. He gives this written document to end the marriage. Woman now marries man B. Cool. But alas, man B also divorces her and gives her a get. This woman now can marry man C, but she's not allowed to go back and marry man A. And the reason for this, the Torah anticipated that crazy trait. I was way too little of a kid to remember this when I was alive, but I wasn't in the game. Is in the 1973, those two Yankee pitchers, Mike Kekich and Fritz Peterson, they traded wives. And for that matter, they each had two kids and they swapped one of the kids. I think they swapped dogs. It was one of the most disgusting trades in baseball history. And it just simply cheapened everything. They spent a lot of time together, and before you know it, they decided it would be better all around to trade wives. You could look it all up if you're unfamiliar with it. So it's Mike Kekich and Fritz Peterson, two pitchers on the New York Yankees in the 1970s. So the Torah is trying to avoid this exact behavior. Marriage is sacred. And the idea that a woman can legitimately have an affair simply by having a sofer show up and write a bunch of gets is not happening. The Torah outlaws going back to man A for that reason. That's the basic law, okay? The prophet Jeremiah, living at the time of the destruction of the first temple, where all Jews thought that the God-Israel relationship was coming to an end, magnifies this halachic imagery with regard to God. In source number 8, it is said, if a man sends away his wife and she goes from him and becomes another man's, shall he return to her again? The answer to that question, of course, is no. She's not allowed to remarry man A. Shall not that land be greatly polluted? You have played the harlot with many lovers, yet return to me, says God. God says, okay, God and Israel were married. Israel committed adultery through her idolatry, and therefore God divorced her. Now she's married to idols. God is saying, even though you're married to idols and I'm husband A, divorce the idols and come back to me. In other words, God is poignantly overriding Torah law as husband A and saying that I want you back. So here, even using the divorce imagery that Jeremiah does, unlike any other prophet, all the others stick with separation, not divorce. He uses divorce imagery, but it ends up being the same thing. It still ends up being that the God-Israel relationship, even though it can get on the rocks with sinful behavior, never ends. It is a permanent relationship. So to answer our question, what happens if Israel sins? Can Israel lose its chosen status? The answer is, of course, yes, no. Right? The prophets make that amply clear. Yes, it can lose its chosen status and become separated from God, but no, there's never a permanent severing of that relationship. God always will view the people of Israel as the chosen people, and that will never, ever, ever change. The same prophet Jeremiah, in one of his prophecies of consolation, says this very powerfully in source number 9. Thus said the Lord, who established the sun for light by day, the laws of the moon and stars for light by night, who stirs up the sea into roaring waves, whose name is Lord of hosts. If these laws should ever be annulled by me, declares the Lord, only then would the offspring of Israel cease to be a nation before me for all time. This is correct. What Jeremiah, he doesn't need my approval. What Jeremiah is saying is simply fully in sync with the entire biblical picture, that even though there was a separation at the time of the exile or whenever there's terribly sinful behavior on the part of the Jewish people, God always has his arms open to restore that marriage. Okay, so to answer that question, can Israel jeopardize its chosen status? The answer is yes, no, but never permanently. So, being a good rabbi that I am, that means that the debate between Rambam and Ramban versus Maharal that we discussed before, they're both right. Maharal is saying that there's a permanent aspect of the God-Israel relationship. That is correct. But there's also a contingent aspect of the relationship as per Rambam and Ramban based on righteous behavior. Okay, so both sides turn out to simply be half of the story as the prophets portray it. Okay, that's part A. Part B is, can other nations, if they become good, can they become chosen people again? In other words, was the Tower of Babel, was that a permanent divorce between God and humanity? Or was that simply a separation too? I'm going to have a suspenseful drink of water and then I'll tell you. The most poignant passage in the entire Bible that answers this question directly is in the book of Isaiah also. It's in source number 10. Chapter 19 of Isaiah is, for the most part, a prophecy of doom against 8th century BCE Egypt, that the Egyptians were rotten and the Assyrians are coming and they're going to inflict a lot of harm on the Egyptians. But here Isaiah then breaks into a futuristic, positive vision. And he says, in that day, in some future day, 5 cities in the land of Egypt shall speak the language of Canaan and swear by the Lord of hosts. One shall be called the city of destruction. In that day there shall be an altar to the Lord in the midst of the land of Egypt, and a pillar at its border to the Lord. So one day, not today, but one day off in the future, the people of Egypt will worship God alone. And for that matter, even the wicked Assyrians, who were the great enemy superpower of that time, they also will worship God. In that day shall Israel be third with Egypt with Assyria, a blessing in the midst of the land, whom the Lord of hosts shall bless, saying, blessed be Egypt my people, and Assyria the work of my hands, and Israel my inheritance. There you go, people. So here you have, it's the only place in the entire Tanakh that a non-Israelite nation is called my nation by God. But here you have it. And that simply adds up to what we would have thought. God doesn't reject humanity permanently at the time of the Tower of Babel. Rather, that's one large-scale separation. But were there to be a time where people of the world, whether individuals or entire nations or the whole world, would once again serve God in the way that Noah was supposed to serve God, well then, they're chosen again. The definition of chosen people in Tanakh is now very straightforward. You are chosen when you choose God. For non-Jews, that's the 7 Noahide laws, a basic monotheistic morality. And for the people of Israel, that is adherence to the Torah, because God gave a covenantal law that's unique to the people of Israel. Okay? So far, so good. As much as, it sounds like, 21st century political correct stuff, or at least mostly. It's not as politically correct because there's still a division between Israel and the nations in this vision, because there is a division between Israel and the nations in the biblical portrait. There's no way I'm going to try to flatten that, nor do I desire to. I'm interested in what does the Tanakh really say. I think that it's clear that there is a distinction between Israel and the nations, which we will get to. But before we get there, we have to understand that from Adam being created in God's image, all people being one family, all people having the Noahide laws, and all the way down to the Messianic era, where all peoples of the world will once again serve God, the idea of chosenness is when you choose God. Again, for Noachides, meaning for Gentile nations, that means the 7 Noahide laws. And for the people of Israel, that means full adherence to the Torah as God commanded it. Okay. This text was incredibly not politically correct to Jews of the Hellenistic period. Some Jews really resented the fact that God would ever call a different nation my chosen nation, besides the people of Israel. They liked the idea of, it's just us. God chose the Jews, and forget about the rest of the world forever. So in the Septuagint, in the Greek translation of source number 10, they added just one little thing. I mean, I don't know the Greek, but I'm aware of this change. The Hebrew is Baruch Ami Mitzrayim, blessed be my nation Egypt. And that refers to the Egyptians who are now serving God. That's what Isaiah is talking about. The Septuagint couldn't handle that. So it simply added it would have been one letter in Hebrew, which is Baruch Ami B'Mitzrayim. Blessed be my nation who lives in Egypt, meaning the Jews who live there. And Rashi, without knowing the Septuagint, likewise understands the verse that way, by the way. Rashi rigs it so that it refers to the Jews in Egypt, or who were redeemed from Egypt, rather than Egyptians who are now serving God. But most other commentaries understand plainly, as Ibn Ezra, Radak, and many others understand on source 10, no, Isaiah is actually saying that Egyptians, once they become ethical monotheists again, they too can be chosen again. And that's fully in sync with what the biblical vision is all about. And that brings us over to source number 11, The prophet Zwania, who lived in 7th century BCE, obviously in the south because the north has already been exiled, envisions, after predicting the doom of the world basically, says that then in this future messianic time, for then I will convert the peoples to a clear language, that they may all call upon the name of the Lord to serve him with one accord. There actually were a couple of commentaries who understood this to mean that in the future, all nations of the world will speak Hebrew. And that's the clear language. That's cool. I don't think that that's what it means. Most commentaries understand that this verse refers to not a language in the Hebrew sense, but in the sense of all nations will serve God properly. It's an ideology rather than a language, the way that you and I would talk about it, that kind of language. So on one level, that's what he's predicting. Zwania prophesies that there will be a universal language of God morality, and all people will be good. Lovely. In the good old days, in the medieval period, there were communities in Egypt and in Israel that kept what was called the Triennial cycle of Torah readings. So instead of breaking up the Torah into weekly Torah portions the way that the Babylonian rabbis did, which we all follow, which is that we complete the whole Torah every year, these communities in medieval Israel and Egypt completed the Torah every 3 or so years. It wasn't exactly 3 years, but it was a little over 3 years. So that means that each Torah reading was shorter. Now, the bad news was that if your job was to make those little flags that kids wave on Simchat Torah, your business would suffer, because Simchat Torah is now just every 3.5 years or so. So you should find a different profession if you lived in those medieval communities. The good news is now the rabbis of those communities had to choose a lot more haftarot, because suddenly each parasha is just 1/3 of what you and I think of as a parasha. So every third of a Torah portion needed to have its own haftarah. So these medieval communities chose as the haftarah for the Tower of Babel this passage in Zwania. The whole point of Tower of Babel is people left God and became arrogant and power hungry and idolatrous, and then their language became confused. Zwania is envisioning a time where the Tower of Babels of the world will fall and everybody will speak a clear language. And so the medieval rabbis in Egypt and Israel understood quite well the connection between Zvanya's vision and the Tower of Babel, that this was the breaking point between God and humanity, but in the future, all humanity is going to come back and will be re-embraced. So just to summarize, all people are one family, all people are created in God's image, and the messianic ideal is for all people to live in the Garden of Eden. It's going to be one united humanity serving God because they've all chosen God, and therefore all people will be chosen. That's all very rosy. Now, Israel plays a unique role in this process, which is already set out in various Torah passages. One is, just historically speaking, Israel was the first nation to operate this way. And that's why God says in source number 12, then you shall say to Paro, thus says your Lord, Israel is my firstborn son. That's just a fact. In other words, the idea that later on other nations will embrace God, but they were not first, right? The prophet in the book of Isaiah in chapter 54, you have the idea of Eshet Neurim. Likewise, Israel is God's first spouse. And it's the same idea. Historically, there's no other way to say it. That in fact, the people of Israel were first, and God acknowledges that we were the trailbreakers from the time of Abraham and Moses all the way down that helped spread this vision. Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik was very quick to point out on this verse that the whole idea is that all nations are God's children. We just happen to be the firstborn, right? But nobody is not God's children. Everybody is God's children. We're the firstborn child, but everybody else is very much part of that family as well. That is, again, Rav Soloveitchik doesn't need my help either, but that is just plain correct within the biblical evidence. And that's part A. Part B is what Rabbi Ovadia Sforno, who is having a great day, points out the other component, which goes back to Abraham. Abraham was the first teacher, and Rabbi Sforno understands that that's what it means to be a kingdom of priests. So source 13 here, and you shall be to me a kingdom of priests. He's commenting on source number 5 that we looked at earlier. And in this manner, you will be a treasure, for you will be a kingdom of priests to teach the entire human race to call in God's name and to serve him alike. As it is written, you shall be called God's priests, and as it is written, for Torah will come from Zion. Rabbi Sforno understands very, very, very well that Israel plays not only a role historically that we were the first nation to embrace God in this way and to strike a covenantal relationship with God, but that we have a role to teach humanity, which was Abraham's job. Abraham was chosen because he was the world's first teacher. Okay, so we're the nation of Abraham. Our job is to set the model build a model nation that will inspire all the nations of the world. And that's what the prophets all envision. That in the future, people will see, wow, Israel is just doing so wonderfully. They've built such a beautiful society. We want to come serve God and emulate them. The prophetic vision exactly emerges from the giving of the Torah, that we were the original nation of teachers and we were supposed to set a nation. So I remember as a kid, I had to take the SATs when I was in high school. And when it came to my verbal section, my friends, I don't know if you know this, but in the meantime, a lot of my friends after the PSAT, which is the practice round of the SATs, a lot of my friends called me Israeli. Not because my Hebrew was any good, but because my verbal scores were roughly comparable to that of the non-English speaking Israelis in my class. Okay, so I liked being called Israeli, but not necessarily in the way that I might have idealized wanting to be called it for that reason. That was the case. So in the meantime, I did a little better on my verbal on the SAT, but whatever. In the meantime, one of the things that killed me were these miserable analogies, which I believe are not even on the SAT anymore. But I didn't even know what they were. So I had a rough time figuring out how to answer any of the questions, which is why I was so Israeli in that regard. But now I know what an analogy is. So the analogy that the whole Tanakh is trying to set out, which Rabbi Ovadia Sforno just said without knowing about the SATs, is that non-Jew is to Jew as Jew is to Kohen. That's the analogy. If you answer anything else, you would have gotten not an 800. Non-Jew is to Jew as Jew is to Kohen. And the logic is that Kohanim have been selected from within the Jewish people as a genetic family thing, just as the Jewish people are a genetic family thing. And that goes for converts also. Converts people who convert to Judaism immediately join the family. They're not just adopting a religious ideology. They immediately become the children of Abraham and Sarah. Okay, so that's A. B, the Kohanim have additional commandments beyond that we regular Israelites have. Right, so too, the people of Israel have more commandments in the Torah for them than non-Jews have. The goal of the Kohanim is to guard and serve in the temple to serve the people of Israel. The goal of the people of Israel is to guard and serve in the temple for the world, which all has access to the temple when they serve God. And just as the Kohanim were expected to teach the people of Israel Torah, so too the Israelites or the Jews are supposed to teach Torah to the world. The analogy is full. The only difference between that where would break down is that a regular Israelite cannot convert to become a Kohen. That actually is just the Aaron family, and that is it. But other than that conversion block, you can't become a Kohen. You can become a Nazir where you emulate a Kohen, but you can't become a Kohen. The whole analogy is full, and that's exactly what the Tanakh is trying to do, and that's what Sforno is saying. Rabbi Ovadia Sforno is saying, becoming a nation of priests simply means we're priests to the nation. Our job is to serve in the temple and to be the teachers for all of humanity. For those who are not satisfied not being the nation of priests, conversion is always an option. So non-Jews who wish to become full Jews may. That's a very admirable thing indeed. But if they remain as they are, they're fully chosen people when they are religiously and ethically inclined. And that's how the Torah sets this up. So Abraham was the first teacher of the world, and he's considered the father of all nations because of his religious vision to everybody. The Tanakh sets out how the first 10 generations from Adam to Noah failed. The next 10 generations from Noah to Abraham failed. And the rest of world history is about, can the people of Abraham, meaning the Jewish people, finally build that ideal society that the Torah wants us to build so that we can inspire all the nations of the world to embrace God and ethical behavior as all Noachites are supposed to do, and so that we can actually live together as one united family, all chosen people. So that is the gist of what it means to be chosen. And I see that we have some participation on the sidelines, so let me address that, and then we have a little more time. We'll be able to do more. Okay, this is about source sheets. Welcome, Nathan from Johannesburg, South Africa. So cool. Bless Zoom for that alone. Okay. Sacrifice. That's an excellent question. It's a private question also, but agreed, Myron. That's a very big discussion that requires its own shiur about sacrifice. Maharal might be a response to Christianity's claims, by the way, but it also could just be that he's correct in noting that it doesn't say that God chose Abraham because he was righteous. There's an interpretive component of that as well. Next, do you think Rashi has a tendency to limit the universal vision of Judaism? Sometimes yes. Rashi sometimes does take a more Judeo-centric and Judeo-loving approach from that which is warranted by the evidence. And this is the ones that we discussed today are good examples, and there are others as well. So yeah, that could happen sometimes. So Gentiles who accept Hashem are also chosen. Yes, that is the point of the shiur. That is correct. And that's what the prophet Isaiah already put forth in source number 10. That nations of the world who once again adopt what you and I would call the 7 Noahide laws and serve God properly would immediately do that. If you visited Sforno's apartment, that is so cool. I'm sorry he wasn't there, but his presence is with all of us. Okay, so that takes care of the questions that were there, but we have a few more minutes. This is an excellent opportunity. You could just use the chat to type in a question, and definitely feel free. This is a great moment for that. Also, please address it to everyone, because when you do it privately and I don't realize that, then when I reply, I don't realize that nobody else sees the question. Going once. Okay, going twice. Still do it. Okay, here we go. Not sold. Hold on, this is great. Here we go. So let's see this. Oh, wow, a lot of things just happened in that going twice. That's so cool. Hold on. So let's roll down. How does this approach jive with the mainstream Jewish attitude toward converts, non-Jews interested in Judaism, so that many Jewish communities are more insular toward outsiders? So that's a very important question that hopefully I'll deal with in coming shiurim also in this series, meaning not just in life. These are things that I think about a lot. Professor Menachem Kellner, who taught at Haifa University for many years, we're good friends now. We communicate all the time, but he's my teacher also. I read all of his stuff and communicate with him about, this is one of his main topics. There are very powerful strands in Jewish thought that take what's called an essentialist approach, meaning that Jews are born superior to everybody else in a metaphysical sense. This view took off with the Kuzari. Rabbi Yehuda Halevi believes that Jews are metaphysically superior. You know, we don't look different necessarily. We can't play basketball better than everybody, but in a metaphysical sense, we are more spiritually in line with God, and we are the only ones who can receive prophecy, according to him, even though non-Jewish people receive prophecy in the Tanakh itself. He doesn't care. So this view is new in the 12th century in Spain. He kind of just made it up. There are no biblical antecedents to that at all. And there are very few rabbinic statements that could even remotely be construed in that direction. The standard view, and again, I'm focusing on the biblical side of things, is much more in sync with Rambam's point of view, which is that the non-essentialist position. God chose the people of Israel not because they are genetically superior in any way, but because of the behavior of Abraham. So that's the biblical view. And that's correct, meaning that there is no sense whatsoever that God chose us because we were already born genetically superior, and therefore, basically, God had to choose us because we're better. There's simply none of that in Rambam's writing. For Rambam, it's all about embracing God, and that applies to all of humanity, not simply the people of Israel. Mysticism, Jewish mysticism, starting with the Zohar and many later mystical texts, likewise took on the point of view that there is a Jewish soul and a non-Jewish soul. And so those who are mystically inclined or even influenced by mysticism likewise believe that somebody who converts to Judaism is not equal to somebody who is born Jewish, because their soul is still non-Jewish. And Rabbi Yehuda Halevi that I mentioned before, likewise believes that converts are admirable, but they can never fully be like a born Jew because their soul is deficient, right? So these views most certainly are out there, and these are powerful views. The Zohar exerted an enormous influence on Jewish thought. So did Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, and so did others. And Maharal also, who I mentioned earlier, he also believes that Jews are essentially better than non-Jews. So these views are out there, and I know it's all being recorded and will be out there for all time, but this is the truth. So that is what it is. I do not think that there is any biblical antecedent for this view at all. If there were, I would have to deal with it, but there's no text that even remotely suggests that there's any genetic component into God's choosing Abraham or his descendants, okay? So that's that piece. So yes, I think Rambam simply is correct that it all has to do, it's a behavioral, non-essential thing rather than something that's inherent to our birth. Okay, another great excerpt from Sforno. He puts the vision in even more explicit terms. Okay, very good. Very good, thank you. When approached this way, it seems there are no racist overtones. That is correct. There's no racist anything in the Tanakh. Tanakh has nothing racial about it. It's all about behavior. This goes, by the way, we're not going to have a shiur on that in this series, the war against the Canaanites. There's no battle against the Canaanites because of anything ethnic. It has to do with the fact that they're wicked people. And the Torah emphasizes, I don't know how many times, that if the people of Israel behave like the Canaanites, they too will be expelled from the land. Right? There's nothing genetic. It's not about DNA. It's all behavioral. And so this is critical. So, and that's with the despised people where God commands war against them. Same thing with Amalek, right? So not that there aren't other moral issues to discuss on that topic, but that belongs to a totally different kind of shiur. But for our purposes, there's nothing ethnic. It's not that we think that they're genetically inferior or that they are born evil. It's that they've chosen to be evil. So therefore, God has a problem with evil behavior, okay? Firstborn is regularly downplayed, so what is the advantage? In life, of course, that's right, as a firstborn who has a big biblical hang-up about this, who realizes that the firstborn never wins. I don't like it when God calls Israel God's firstborn, because, yeah, the firstborn always loses. That all being said, that's not how God means it, so it appears in that sentence. That sentence means what, Paro would understand, that it is God's prized son, or the first one, and that's simply a historical advantage that the people of Israel had. Okay, conversely, but just follow it along. One of the messages of Tanakh, of course, is that you don't win just because you happen to be the firstborn. Your behavior is what determines that. That's what the whole Tanakh is about, and the firstborn piece of that is quite related to that. Conversely, Jews who do not accept all the laws are not chosen. Yes, no, right? Exactly what we talked about before. Jews who violate the Torah, or on the one hand, they jeopardize the chosen status, whether of the entire nation or of individuals. I'll let God work out how much is necessary. That's God's problem, not mine. But the fundamental principle is there in the Tanakh, that if we violate the Torah, God forbid, then our chosen nation status is in peril, but never in permanent peril. Where do patrilineal Jews fit in? So in terms of identity, somebody with a Jewish father and a non-Jewish mother can very much feel Jewish, much more so than the other way around, or somebody who's born with two Jewish parents. I don't need to tell you that. That all being said, in Jewish law, a person it's all about the mother, right? Mother or conversion. Those are the two ways to be halachically Jewish. And so what we call a patrilineal Jew is somebody who's not halachically a Jew, even though that person might have a very strong Jewish identity and genuinely contribute meaningfully to the Jewish community and to the community at large. Can you explain again how Maharal and Rambam are both right? Maharal is right that God can never permanently reject the Jewish people because there is a permanent bond. Rambam is right in that an aspect of chosenness is contingent on good behavior. That in fact, God can separate from the Jewish people, but never a permanent divorce as a consequence of that. So that's how they both are correct. Ideally, should be more active in teaching directly to Gentiles. That is a great question. I don't know the answer to that one. Tanakh doesn't frame it that way, though. The way the biblical vision goes, it's not about pouring money into Noahide outreach, although people who do that kind of stuff are amazing. It's about, we need to build a model society that's faithful to the Torah, that will inspire non-Jews just by seeing us. That's the standard prophetic vision. So I like that. I like the idea of developing an ideal community that looks outward, always with the goal of inspiring humanity. Right? But not necessarily by actively proselytizing among non-Jews, but there's no harm in people who do that kind of thing at all. Bechorah versus Bechira, very good. That goes back to the whole Yaakov story, and it never stops being important. Tikkun Olam, likewise, very good. Okay, on that very, very happy note, and we got it all in by 12:58, so we're doing our job. This was great. I'm so thrilled that we have begun this series. Thank you so much for joining in. Next week, we're going to be dealing with a topic where there is a vast gulf between the biblical record and the halachic record. And that is on the topic of what we call in halacha, the ger toshav, a resident alien, meaning how do the people of Israel relate to what we would call today non-Jews living in Israel? And I think that's a critical topic. So we'll focus on the biblical vision, but we'll also spend some time developing the halachic vision, which is a different vision, and how the two play off of each other. So I look forward to doing that with you. Then in the third session, we'll have a messianic fest where we're just going to go through several critical messianic texts of the prophets and then some later rabbinic thought and tie that all together. On that very happy note, I wish everybody good health and a wonderful week, and I look forward to seeing you next week. Have a wonderful week. Take care.